Good evening. It's a pleasure to have you here. To be among those rare people who enjoy being scared, who enjoy ghost stories and supernatural terror. But here in this community, it's a safe space to be weird, to be misunderstood. Here you are not alone. Here we are all like this. Thank you for being part of this strange group of tales of the night. The stories tonight are going to be a bit intense. So, if you're easily suggestible, you might want to listen to them during the day with the lights on, when the house isn't empty. But if you decide to listen under the most terrifying conditions, remember that it's at your own risk, and we're not responsible. Although we will be somewhat pleased if you become the next protagonist of Tales of the Night. Good evening. I hope all members of the community are doing well. I've been listening to the podcast for a long time now, and I'd like to share with you some of the paranormal encounters I've experienced. I would like these stories to be published anonymously. The first story occurred in September 2017, after the earthquake. That big earthquake that hit Mexico, where unfortunately many lives were lost. At that time, I was in my second year of service in the Mexican Army. My battalion was immediately sent to safeguard some of the affected points in the Cuauhtemoc municipality, specifically in the Roma neighborhood of Mexico City. Before we left, they asked us to be careful, as one of the buildings in the area was in very poor condition, so much so that there was a very real risk that it could collapse at any moment. On the first night of guard duty, around 12 a.m., another battalion arrived to relieve us, so we could rest and eat something after almost 12 hours of service. I poured myself a cup of coffee and took a piece of bread to quell my hunger and the cold that was felt at that hour. I had dinner with one of my comrades. A civil protection officer approached us to see if we wanted a cigarette. Although neither of us smoked, we said yes. The truth is, we had only accepted it to be able to start a conversation with him, to distract ourselves. While we were smoking, my companion was hardly talking and suddenly he touched my shoulder to get my attention. "Buddy, look at the window," he said. "There's a woman on the 3rd floor and it seems she's watching us." I replied that it wasn't possible, that that building had been evacuated when it was proven to be very dangerous to remain inside. At first I thought he was joking and I found it in bad taste that he would make that kind of comment at a time like this. "No man, I'm talking seriously," he said. "Look, there's a person inside." We turned, and in the window, we saw a lady who was watching us with a cold look of disgust, as if she was bothered that we were there. We notified our superior on duty of what we had seen, and he gave us the order to enter and search the building, and we entered, despite the risk of the construction collapsing. When we reached where we thought that woman was, we noticed that the apartment door was open. We carefully checked the place, but there was no one inside. Before leaving, we found an old photograph where that woman we saw appeared. It was evident that she lived there. However, my companion had stayed guarding the door. It was impossible for someone to leave or enter the apartment without us noticing. We returned to the area where the civilians were, who for their safety had been evacuated. We showed them the photograph of this woman and asked if they knew her or knew where she was. We really wanted to know what had happened to her. Where could she be? An elderly man approached us. He told us he knew her. We asked him again who this woman was and, more importantly, if he knew where she might be. His answer left us completely cold. He told us that the lady had died of a heart attack precisely during the earthquake. Before dying, she had been ill for several years. She suffered from serious problems. The heart and the stress of the moment and the anxiety of not knowing what to do were too much for her. This gentleman told us that all the neighbors had heard her asking for someone to please help her. They heard her scream that she needed help to get out of her apartment. Suddenly, everything went silent. They didn't hear her voice again. When it was temporarily confirmed that the structure of the place was not damaged and that they could return for their things, the neighbors discovered that the lady had already passed away. The gentleman asked us why we were so interested in that woman, and when we told him that we had seen her in the window, he simply remained silent for a few seconds. He didn't know what to answer us. "Oh boys, there are things that I can't explain to you because they're beyond my understanding," he said. "We can only entrust ourselves to the one above." That man gave us his blessing and walked away until he was lost in the crowd. And well, one would think that a paranormal story, an experience that no one is going to believe you, happens to each of us once. But let me tell you the following. Last year I left the army. As I had a lot of experience, a private security company hired me immediately and even offered me a permanent position. My salary wasn't good, but it allowed me to take care of my family while I was processing some papers I needed to find a better job. This company sent me as a guard to a housing unit, which had been rebuilt by the government, as some of the buildings had collapsed, precisely in that same 2017 earthquake. My main function was to guard the parking lot, because in this part of the city, there are high rates of violence and auto parts theft is very common. On my first day, my supervisor took me to get to know the area and introduced me to the rest of the staff and some of the residents. The first few weeks passed without any incident. I made several rounds during my shift to check that there were no thieves hiding among the cars, and that was mostly what it was about. As I was very good at my job, I quickly gained the trust of the tenants. Between each round, I would return to the guard booth and have a cup of coffee to keep myself awake all night. The strange thing started in my third week of work. It was around midnight. The parking lot was practically deserted. There was only a couple walking their dogs and a woman in her 35 to 40s exercising. During my shift, she approached me. She was pale and couldn't stop shaking. She asked me to please do something, and the first thing I thought was that someone had tried to mug her. "Ma'am, are you okay? Did someone hurt you?" I tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't stop crying. "Look," she said, and she pointed to the park that was in front of the buildings. On the swings there was a girl with her body, with her clothes covered in blood. She was alone. We ran towards her to help her, but when we got to the park, she was no longer there. There weren't even traces of blood on the swings. However, there was a very heavy atmosphere. I was horrified that someone had dared to hurt a child. At that moment, I took my radio and asked for backup. The company I worked for contacted the police and sent a patrol immediately. After taking the lady's statement, the officers patrolled the surroundings to look for the girl, but they couldn't find anything. The next night, I went out to do one of my rounds. As I walked in the parking lot, I began to hear children's laughter, but in the darkness I couldn't see anyone. In front of me, like in a horror movie, a ball fell. "Who's there?" I asked. Nobody answered me. A man looked out his window. He asked me if everything was okay. I told him yes, and said I was looking for the children who had thrown a ball at me, who wouldn't stop laughing at me. I noticed that the man turned pale. It was about 3 in the morning. It wasn't time for children to be playing. "Go back to your booth, officer. This really isn't a good area, less at this hour." He also recommended that I lock myself in the guard booth. I don't know if you're a believer, but if you can, say a prayer and trust yourself to God. He didn't say anything else. He simply closed his window. I could see how he secured it. Several days later, on a Monday during the early morning, I was more tired than usual. I even had trouble standing up. However, I prepared myself to do my round. As some light bulbs had burned out, I couldn't see well where I was going. I walked very slowly so as not to fall. I heard children's laughter again. This time they came from the building in front of me. As it was on a slope, I could see the roof where some tenants have their clothes hanging. There was a small boy there, leaning against the wire mesh. When he saw me, he started smiling at me. He waved at me. I waved back. I thought maybe he was helping his mom wash clothes. I didn't feel scared at that moment. He seemed like a completely normal child. I even found him endearing. I was only worried that he might fall off the roof. Suddenly I realized he wasn't alone. There was a girl too, a couple of years older than him. She smiled at me. She was a very pretty girl, but something about her horrified me. She was wearing a pink dress, and suddenly I could notice, as if appearing out of nowhere, that it was covered in blood and dirt. Her gaze gave me chills. I was paralyzed for a few moments. I felt that my body wasn't responding to me. As soon as I could move, I ran to the booth and locked myself inside. I tried to rest a bit, but despite how tired I was, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that girl again. I had the feeling that she wasn't far away, that she was out there, in the darkness, that she was watching me. Around 5 in the morning, one of the building's residents knocked on the booth door. "Are you okay?" he asked me. "You're very pale, cop. You look like you've seen a ghost." When I heard that phrase, I couldn't contain myself. I started crying. "Don't tell me you saw them too," he said. "Look, I have to go to work. When I come back, if you're still here, we'll talk about it." The man just said goodbye to me and left. When my shift ended, I changed my clothes, started my motorcycle, and went home. I fell asleep a couple of times, but I kept having nightmares with these children. Their laughter, it got into my dreams. They wouldn't leave me alone. All day I was thinking about that man's words. If I tell them what I saw, they'll surely think I'm crazy, I thought. They'll even say that I used drugs to stay awake all night. At that moment, I thought I could lose my job, and that wasn't a possibility. When I arrived at the housing unit, I found that man waiting for me in the guard booth. "You came back," he said, surprised. I nodded yes. I parked my motorcycle. He asked me what I had seen, and I didn't want to answer, but he kept insisting until I agreed to tell him. "I hope you're not going to think I'm crazy, or worse, a drug addict. I swear, I'm not out of my mind," I told him. Then I told him everything that had happened to me, not just the night before. I also told him about the blood-stained girl I had seen playing on the swings. He listened to me very carefully. He looked truly interested in my words. "Boy, you do know what happened here, right?" he asked. "When you started working, didn't they tell you that these apartments collapsed with the earthquake?" I said yes. "Well, many people died here. I would say may God have them in His holy glory. But the truth is that many of these deceased have not been able to find peace." I couldn't believe what he was telling me. He told me about an 11-year-old girl and her 7-year-old little brother who were alone when the earthquake occurred, who didn't manage to evacuate the building in time. They died in the collapse. The rescuers didn't find their bodies until several days later. "Don't be afraid. They were children, cheerful and affectionate with others," he told me, and then fell silent for a few seconds. He had a close relationship with many of the people who had died. It was evident that our conversation was being painful for him, but he finally broke the silence again. "I don't know how to name them. I don't know what they are, but I can assure you that they are not bad. Maybe they approach you because they feel lonely, out of curiosity, or to take care of you." I replied that it chilled my blood to feel their gaze, and that their laughter followed me wherever I went. He emphasized that they didn't approach me to hurt me, that they would be incapable of doing something like that. He told me that these children's parents were the only survivors of that family. They left fleeing from the pain that being there caused them. They couldn't bear to live in a place full of memories of their children, and they returned to Puebla, where they were originally from. But apparently, they weren't the only ones to leave. Many families took the little they had left and left for fear that it would shake again, that the buildings would collapse again. "I'm going to give you some advice," he said. "Entrust yourself to God. Pray before starting your round, your shift, but also pray for those little angels so they can rest. They really don't deserve to be wandering like this. He told me that some of the neighbors left them sweets or toys to keep them entertained, so they wouldn't play any tricks on them. If you are good to them, they will help you, he said. Who knows? Maybe they can even protect you from the thieves who are always prowling around here. I decided to believe him. From that moment on, I did what he told me, and my nights were calmer. During the time I was working there, I prayed before starting my shift. I asked God to keep me safe, and I also asked that his children could rest in peace. From time to time, I would leave them an offering, a small token of my respect. I continued to hear their laughter, but I never saw them again. I knew they were still there with me, and that they would come out to the parking lot to play, especially at night, but their presence no longer intimidated me. In the end, they were just children. I knew their names. Instead of fear, their story caused me deep sadness. I can't say that I love them, because I never had the pleasure of knowing them in life, but I do imagine the pain they must be experiencing, and to this day I keep them in my prayers. I have omitted some details so as not to affect the people who live in this area or who were my companions in the army. I hope to soon be able to tell you other anecdotes. Thank you very much for listening to me, community. Thank you very much, Uriel, for giving voice to my story. No, thank you. Anonymous person who shares your stories with us, these previous stories. And we remind you who are listening that you can do it too. And if they don't appear soon, don't get discouraged. These last ones we just heard, for example, reached us in 2022, I think. Remember that we always try to make a mix between stories that have just arrived and old stories that haven't been written for a long time and haven't had the opportunity to appear on the program. Thank you very, very much. But we're not done yet. It's time to continue with more stories tonight. Hello, community. My name is Lexi. I shared this story in the group, but I wanted you to hear it too. What I'm going to tell you happened to my dad when he was just under 12 years old. For a long time, he would stay alone in the early mornings at home despite being very young. His mom had to go out to work, as she was a waitress, and his brother, being older, would go out with his friends. But since gangs are very common in that area, my dad didn't like to accompany him. He preferred to stay home alone. One of those nights he was in the living room, right next to the main door. He was lying down watching TV, when 2 knocks were heard at the door. For a moment he thought about opening, but as it was past 12, he didn't trust it. So he just waited and thought that maybe it was his brother or his mom who had already arrived, but then he thought that they would have a key or would simply call him by his name. He checked the time. It was too early for it to be them, so he decided to peek through the window he had next to him, in case it was a stranger, so as not to open the door directly. When he looked out, he saw nothing and decided to lie back down, thinking the person had left because he took too long to answer. Suddenly, a sound interrupted his thoughts. It was the door again, the knocks again. He looked out once more, and again there was no one. But at that moment, instead of getting scared, he thought that perhaps it was his friends playing a prank on him. So instead of going back to bed or ignoring it, he stayed by the window to surprise them, to see when they would approach to knock again. As soon as he heard the first knock on the door, he approached the window, and before the second knock came, he opened the curtain as quickly as he could. But he saw nothing. But that, instead of calming him, terrified him, because there was no way someone could hide so quickly, that there wasn't someone behind the door. Even from the angle of the window, he could see down to the floor. It was impossible for someone to be crouched down, hiding. Without thinking, he ran to the couch and lay down. He covered himself and turned up the volume on the television and ignored the sounds again, as they would be heard every so often. Every so often, someone would approach to knock. Later, he learned that the next day, when his mom was coming home from work, A neighbor approached her to tell her something. She told her that she needed to know that every night, without fail, a lady dressed in white would stand in front of their door and stay there, motionless for a long time, until suddenly she would go into the doghouse that was next to the window and wouldn't come out again until the next night. The doghouse was a small room outside the house where pets slept or they left the trash. Upon hearing this, out of precaution and without thinking it was something paranormal, she shared it with her children so they would be careful, thinking that it was perhaps a person who was prowling around the neighborhood where they lived. Of course, they saw the doghouse every day and had never found anything strange, no one there, or any sign that someone was using it for shelter. My dad didn't take it so lightly. When his mom told him about it, a terrible chill ran through his entire body, as he thought about the possibility that night that if instead of looking out the window, he had decided to open the door, as was his first thought, the possibility that he would have seen that woman face to face, and even worse, that she would have entered his house while he was alone. I wish I could tell you that this is the only thing that happened to my father there. But after constant nights alone, there are many stories to tell. So as soon as I can, I'm going to gather them and share them with you if you're interested. Thank you for your attention, and have a very good night, community.